Okay, so one more time, hello, welcome, and thanks for joining us at our webinar regarding the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme and the inclusion of the maritime sector. So the reason why we're all here today is obviously to learn a little bit about the EU ETS, but also to kind of explore the opportunities that we have to deal with this efficiently. So the agenda in front of you is a brief introduction of us, the speakers, then a very brief introduction as well of the company ACT. And then we jump right into the basics of the EU ETS. After that, Dennis will lay out the specifics for the maritime sector. I will briefly speak about the procurement strategies that we have for EUAs. And it's back to Dennis for the optimization of our obligations with the use of biofuels. And then at the end of it, we have time for a Q&A. We'll probably, after roughly 45 minutes, take a 1-minute break to go through the questions in case anything pops up. So please use the chat box. Please go ahead and type any questions that you might have throughout the webinar. And quick disclaimer, obviously, because we have a very broad audience today. The basics of the EU ETS might be quite obvious to some on the operational side, for example, but might be very interesting for people on the procurement side who have to deal with buying EUAs now, but don't really know what the system is, right? On the other hand, the procurement strategies might be quite obvious for the traders among us, but not so obvious for the people joining from the operational side. So because we have a very broad audience, we have to go on the basics, but I'm hoping that with some interesting questions in the Q&A, we can dive deeper and have a bit of a dialogue, a discussion on this. What is definitely going to be interesting is the optimization of the obligations using biofuels. So I hope there's a little bit for everybody, and then we can start with a quick intro. Yes, so I'll just quickly start. My name is Dario Papst. I'm at ACT for 6+ years now, actually, and I'm currently the head of the desk for EUA trading in the German region, and I'm working for ACT Financial Solutions. I have taken over the responsibility of helping our shipping counterparties and clients kind of navigate their own obligations in the EU ETS, and that's why I'm joining here today.
And hi guys, I'm Dennis van Beurden. I'm leading the business development of the maritime decarbonization regarding sustainable marine fuels. So I am client facing with a lot of ship owners for setting up trials or even long-term contracts regarding biofuels.
So next up, yeah, we are ACT, right? So thank you for joining us one more time. Who are we? We are the leading provider globally operating for sustainability solutions. Basically, what that means is that we are traders with a very consultative approach to our key markets. We have offices in Amsterdam, where we are speaking to you now, in New York, in Shanghai, Paris, and Singapore. Serving 5,000 clients and counterparties in over 40 countries. And some key figures would be that we just in the year of 2022, we offset 50 million tons of carbon. We traded roughly 150 terawatt hours of renewable electricity. And we are also fully vertically integrated fuel supplier of biofuels. As I briefly touched upon a second ago, I am talking to you from the company ACT Financial Solutions. We are a MiFID regulated trading house, specializing in those environmental commodities that require a trading license. And our primary activity is providing market access and liquidity within the EU ETS. The markets of ACT are very broad, but can be boiled down into 4 pillars. That is renewable energy, which means renewable electricity, as well as biomethane, so renewable gas. emissions, which includes compliance products such as the EU ETS products or the voluntary carbon markets, energy efficiency certificates, and also project implementation, specifically in Paris and France. And then, once again, Dennis here from ACT Fuels joins us from our renewable fuels and feedstock trading business. And we go right into the basics of the EU ETS. So, as I mentioned earlier, the reason why we're here is to learn a little bit about the EU ETS, but also to understand the challenges that will come towards you in the near future, starting 2024. And to not only understand this challenge a little bit better, but to also highlight the chance of the opportunity of dealing with this in a proper way and gaining potentially an advantage, competitive edge with dealing with your new obligations efficiently, effectively, and in an easy way. So what is the EU ETS, right? In a brief sentence, it is the effort of the European Union to decrease and decarbonize its industry, decrease its carbon emissions from an industry standpoint, and achieve its goals and commitments on the Paris Agreement. So the way that it can be seen is a little bit like a carbon tax, but the height of this carbon tax, the value of this carbon tax, is dependent on market movements and market sentiment. So it is a cap and trade scheme. What it means in terms of numbers is that there's roughly 1.5 billion allowances used or available in the year 2021, and that amount of allowances is constantly decreasing until we have achieved our goal of 55% reduction of CO2 emissions by the year 2030. The unit, or let's say the currency of the EU ETS, is the EU allowance, European Union allowance, the EUA. And it is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2. 1 EUA equals 1 ton of CO2. The EU ETS handles around 11,000 power stations, manufacturing plants, and also the emissions from flights are included in the EU ETS. And overall, that would mean roughly 45% of all GHG emissions are actually handled within the EU ETS and governed with the EU ETS prices. What is maybe interesting to say is that the European Union emissions trading scheme is actually one of the, it's almost the biggest one, except for the Chinese one that popped up recently. It is the one that is actually effective in what it tries to achieve, which means that for the years of its operation, the GDP of Europe has increased while the emissions have decreased, and the price of carbon has also gone up. So even while we have charged our industry a higher amount, higher costs for emitting carbon, we actually managed to keep the GDP increasing. So that means it's one of the only actually working emission trading systems. If we move one slide ahead, thank you. So here you can see it visualized, right? So it should be roughly 55% lower by the year 2030 as compared to the baseline year of 2005. The emissions are currently, the available emissions are currently reduced by 2.2% per year and should be dropping to roughly 55% decrease. So how do EUAs actually enter into the supply? First of all, we have the primary market auctions. These governmental auctions are set up at the EEX, the energy exchange in Leipzig, and it requires a clearing bank to be admitted to these auctions, and the revenues that are generated from these auctions are actually used to innovate and modernize the European power supply, certain European industries, and are used to specifically further our own decarbonization efforts, right? So the money that is raised from the EU ETS is actually put into place to further decarbonize our industry. So it really works together here. The second way that allowances enter the market are free allocations. Free allocations are given as a subsidy for now to industrial players in the EU. These allowances will slowly but steadily disappear in the 30s. However, the maritime industry will not be receiving any free allocations. So all EUAs that are required for your obligations will actually need to be bought either on a primary or secondary market. So the secondary market, that's where trading houses like ourselves come in, functions in principle like any other commodity market. We purchase allowances on the EEX and the ICE, and we trade roughly 2 million allowances a month. The next thing that is also heading your way, of course, and is very good to be prepared about, is the EU ETS compliance cycle. So before you can actually hand in emission allowances or purchase emission allowances, you need to know how many you emitted or how many tons of carbon you emitted throughout the year. And the most important parts, right, like once again, in the sense of brevity, I don't want to go through the entire cycle. We can talk about it in one-on-one meetings. But the two most important dates are seen on the right. The 31st of March is when you need to submit your emissions report to the relevant authorities, and the 30th of April when you actually need to surrender your emission allowances in the EU ETS registry for the previous year. So those two dates are very important. Now, what is also a little bit different in the EU ETS rather than other or conventional commodity markets are the price drivers. Of course, we have supply and demand driving these prices as in any other market. Demand coming, for example, as well from the electricity generation sector. So the power generation sector, power production sector in Europe also receives zero allocations. What is interesting to mention as well is that in 2027, it is estimated that the shipping industry would be roughly 150 million allowances annually of the total of 1.5 billion, right? So roughly 10%. However, the electricity sector also receives zero allocation, just like the maritime sector, but represents roughly a third of the total need. That's annually in the EU ETS. So you can see that a large price driver is the costs of power production. However, the special thing about the EU ETS is that it's a very political market. It's driven by regulation because the whole market is created by regulatory intervention. So what you see in front of you are upcoming expected changes to the legislation, who will be defining points in the price development of the EUA prices, right? So at the moment it's roughly $100, $100. But in January this year it was at $75, right? So it can be very, very volatile. One of the upcoming things, for example, is that the 2030 reduction goal of carbon emissions will be even increased from 55% to 62%, right? So we're trying to save an additional 7% of emissions in order to meet our obligations in the Paris Agreement. And that can obviously have a strong effect on EUA prices. Yes, here we can see the price development, right? very interesting to observe for people that are not in the market for a very long time. But yeah, in 2018 and before, we were definitively below 20 euros an EUA. And we see that, you know, you can see if you look at the price development, certain defining moments such as March 2020 obviously had a sharp drop in EUA prices. But then if you look in the end of 2021, when it became clear that these new climate ambitions will be translated into the European law, into the European directives, we see a massive increase. And then in the March 2022, we see a massive drop. So it is very important to be aware of the price drivers, and that is, for one, the supply and demand side, but also the regulatory side. Yes, and also very interesting, of course. So what he's saying here is a survey of analysts, price analysts that have given a price forecast for the EUA. And what we like to do is we look at all of them and we average them out in order to see where the picture is moving towards, right? Interesting to point out here is that in the year 2026, when the shipping industry is 100% included in the EU ETS, you already have an expectation of roughly 125 euros. Yeah, prices are in euros, by the way. Yeah. So you already have an expectation of 125 euros. So it is crucial, and it can give you a very big advantage or competitive edge if you start moving now rather than wait until the obligations hit you. And that's in the end why we're all here. Yeah. And
thanks, Dario. I'm going to give a small recap of the inclusion of shipping into the EU ETS, because who will be affected by this? So the European Union decided that in 2024, all commercial vessels above 5,000 gross tonnage will be included in the EU ETS. European Union also decided that in 2027, offshore vessels above 5,000 GT will also be included. And the European Union will decide in 2026 if general cargo and offshore vessels between 400 and 5,000 GT will also be included, because this segment also represents 20 million carbon emissions per year. To look more on the inclusion and the scope, they will look at 100% of the emissions on voyages and port calls within EU ports. So those are subject to the EU ETS. And they will also look at 50% of the emissions emitted during voyages from or to European ports. Shipping will also receive a phase-in, like Dario mentioned, and no free allowances, which means that starting in 2024, shipping will be included for 40% of their total emissions. The year afterwards will be 70%, and then a full inclusion of their emissions in the year 2026. And also, the European Union will start to look at, in the first 2 years, at the carbon emissions, only the carbon emissions emitted tank to wake. And in 2026, it will also include the carbon equivalent, so other greenhouse gases, which means methane and NOx will also be included in the accounting of your emissions. And of course, as shipping companies have been doing since 2018, all emissions are reported to the EU MRV system and verified. To give you a bit of a better understanding, what is actually the cost of an EUA per ton of fuel you buy? Let's say a current price of an emission allowance is around $100, and the emissions of 1 ton of fuel, for example, VLSFO, is 3.2 tons of carbon. That means with the EU ETS, VLSFO will become around $320 more expensive per ton. Or to translate that in the first year with a 40% inclusion, that will give it a $128 premium above VLSFO, which is quite significant for shipping. To understand a bit better the compliance process and exemptions, all companies must register with an administrating authority. For EU countries or companies, this will be with a member state that they are based in. For non-EU companies, it will be registered with the EU state where they would make the most port calls. So let's say, for example, you made most port calls in Rotterdam last year, then your member, your administrating authority would be Rotterdam. And of course, some activities have been exempted from the obligation. For example, service vessels that servicing low population islands, and military vessels and fishing vessels, for example. Of course, there are penalties for non-compliance. First year of being non-compliant means you would pay a $100 fine or €100 fine above your EUA obligations. So above the EUA price you still have to pay. The second year of non-compliance, your fleet could be banned from EU ports, which is quite a significant penalty for being non-compliant. Next slide.
Right, which brings us to various operational challenges which we have discovered in our first exploratory calls already a couple of months ago. And these challenges were really solidified once we had extensive talks with BIMCO as well about how the carbon charge is included in the contractual obligations, right? So who will even have to buy EUAs? Who is actually hurt or hit by the penalties? And who has the compliance obligations for EUAs? So these three questions are made additionally complex by two factors. Number one, ships are very mobile. Not only the ships themselves are mobile, which means that depending on your port calls, you will have different governing authorities, but the fleets themselves are handled by DOCs, right? MRV companies that also handle the MRV part. And these fleets themselves are varying too. So up to what was it on average? 10% of a large ship managing company would 10% of its fleet would change year to year to year. But they are the ones that have, according to the EU regulation, they are the ones, the DOC companies are the ones that have to surrender the EUAs. So at some point, the DOC has to have an established EU ETS registry account. They have to receive allowances into the registry account and then surrender those allowances in April, when, as I showed you on the compliance cycle, end of April, they have to surrender these allowances to the EU authorities. However, the contractual obligations are very, very different in many cases. For example, as BIMCO does it or wants to do it, or plans to do it at the moment, is that who pays for the fuel should pay for the EUAs, should pay for the carbon upcharge, which is often done by operators, charterers, right? Like the companies that are actually using the vessels, not necessarily the owners. And if the company, the shipping company, is the owner of the ship, the user of the ship, and has an inside ship management company, then it's rather simple. But the harsh reality is that that's almost never the case, except for some very big players. And the need to buy EUAs on a continuous level as well is what will add additional complexity to it, because otherwise we've seen the prices are volatile, but otherwise the surrendering company will just purchase EUAs in March or April of the year that they have to hand it in and run into those prices, even though a company that is able to manage it much more effectively and easily can gain a strong competitive advantage, as we've seen in the fuel price upcharges. And then, last but not least, the EU ETS registry accounts. It is not simple, to be honest. It is not simple to make an EU ETS registry account. That will require 2-3 months of registration. You need to have a lot of documents that all need to be apostilled. They all need to be up to date. They all need to be quite recent. And you need to be in constant exchange with these registries. And then maybe next year, your fleet makes more port calls somewhere else, and then you need to start that whole process again. So where do you keep your EUAs? Who has the obligation to hold these EUAs, right? And what we've realized is that this is very idiosyncratic, depending on the contractual obligations and contractual relationships of all these ship owners, charterers, and DOC companies. What we have on offer as a solution are our custody accounts. So what ACT Financial Solutions has is a custody foundation. It's a bankruptcy separated entity which has EU ETS accounts, bank accounts, and all else that you might need, the financial infrastructure to trade and hold EUAs in our counterparties' names. Which means that you can bank EUAs there, you can start buying EUAs, you can use forwards, options, spot transactions, whatever you might want to use, and then place these obligations in the custody accounts in your own name, or in the person that, or in the company's name that would need to pay for it, or who has the ownership of these certificates. Because many times an operator might also just deliver to the ship owner, because the ship owner can be very much damaged by the penalties that we're seeing. Right, so if a ship is banned, if a fleet is banned, the ship owner is just as hurt as the DOC or the charterer, right? So that is the solution that we have to offer. So we can actually start procuring now. You can make use of lower prices. You can make use of our offer right away and just use our custody accounts. And then once we have to hand them in April, it's only 1 or 2 days before April that we send them out to whoever has the actual obligations, and then help you fix that complexity in this way. And now a quick word to our very basic outline of procurement strategies. The general gist of it is, right, that it works as any other commodity market. So the traders among you will be quite familiar with these processes. Spot transactions, relatively simple. Forward transactions help you manage the cash flow a little bit. Options transactions are fine as well. However, because of the volatility and because of the complexity of the new regulations that are coming your way, it is very important to stay on top of the market. How do you stay on top of the market? Most importantly, first and foremost, you would need to set up one-on-one meetings with your consultative traders, right? You need to tell us how we can help you, for example, right? You need to show us budgets, targets, availability, and liquidity constraints that you might have. And then after that initial discussions, we are always available for strategy discussions, explore procurement strategies that are tailor-made, and help you find the best way to also reduce obligations in the first place. After that, it's important that you stay on the market, right? So you start buying your EUAs in tranches, especially if you have a large exposure to it. Let's be talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of allowances per year. You start buying in tranches, right? Like, you don't just go in March and you buy everything in one time and you just eat the price there. No. You start planning your procurement throughout the year. And that can be done with firm orders, either like stop loss orders or limit orders on the way down, or stop loss orders on the way up, right? So that you can focus on your main business. All these procurement strategies or quick ways of staying on top of the market are valid for all the kinds of transactions that we offer, right? Like might it be spot transactions, which is the simplest approach. That includes a settlement of 2 to 5 business days. All you need to do is give us a chat, give us a call, define the volume, define the price, agree on delivery dates, payment dates, settlement dates, and then latest T+5 EUAs are on your account if you have one, or in our custody account. And yeah, the advantage is the simplicity, of course. The next way to procure, as most of you might be aware, are just futures and forwards. It helps you manage your cash flow obligations, right? So of course there will be some margining or some down payment or some payment schedules, right? So the way that we do forwards, for example, is that either you have a margining exposure where we mark to market the movement of the EUAs, or we have a fixed payment schedule. That's also something we can arrange, for example, so that every month you pay, 5% of your obligation until maturity. The most common expiration of the EUA forwards is the December contract. However, it can also be structured end of March, for example, in order to have the cash out more closely to your actual obligation, right? Which is end of April, once again. And last but not least, we are also price and provide liquidity in the options market. This includes both call and put options, so you can have a maximum exposure of the price using a call option. However, it can also be used to buy a collar strategy, for example, right? So you would buy a call option, you can sell a put option in order to decrease the premium and lock in a certain range of exposure here. All of these are things that need to be somewhat tailor-made according to your needs, but we're more than happy to have a discussion about this. Options as well can be structured two ways, either with margining or simply the payment of a premium upfront. Which then brings us to our last but very interesting market access, market availability, which is the primary auction access. Since I believe it was November last year, the EEX opened its doors also to financial intermediaries in the EUA auction, in the primary auction. ACT Financial Solutions, being a member of EEX, has taken this opportunity, and we are happy to provide our financial infrastructure for large buyers of EUAs, and I'm talking 200,000 EUAs a year. We're happy to make this available to our larger clients as well. The benefits, as you can see at the bottom here in this lovely little figure, is that we use our custody foundation to safeguard the payments, which means that the money that you pay for EUAs never really touches ACT. Counterparty risk minimized. On the next step, the next step is that the EEX then sends emission allowances directly to you as the end client or to the custody foundation and holds it there in your name, which means also the transfer of allowances never passes through ACT. Once again, counterparty risk minimized. And now the best of all of this is that, for example, in the year 2022, there was a relatively interesting discount towards the settlement prices, for example, right? So as you can see on the right side of the screen, there is a roughly 80 cents discount per EUA compared to the settlement prices, to the end of day prices, which is usually used for measurement of emission allowance averages throughout the year. So this would allow you, these procurement options would allow you to price an average price into the contract that you're having and procure the emission allowances via the auction all throughout the year, for example, to build this perfect average. And yeah, the other procurement options can also be used to match your needs, right? So as we all know, charters and fuel contracts are done on forward basis for a lot of our counterparties, and that means that you would then hedge these forward exposures using forward contracts or option contracts. As you start making the contracts for your charters and for your fuel procurement, you can immediately in the back end also close the contracts for EUA procurements in order to fit your needs. And yeah, that's already it for our brief excursion into the procurement options. So back to you.
Thanks, Dario, to give a better understanding, I hope, of the EU ETS market. So why is shipping included in the EU ETS is, of course, as a measurement to help decarbonize shipping. And besides some conventional ways of decarbonization for shipping, as slow steaming, hull refitting, biofuels can also help with optimizing your emissions and therefore your obligations. Europe wants to promote biofuels, so biofuels are seen as a zero-emission fuel, which means there's no obligation of buying EUAs if you're using biofuels. To give you a bit of an example, what we're seeing the most in the market is shipping companies sailing with a 30% biofuel blend. They, in 2024, will reduce their obligation with 30%, as that 30% is seen as a zero-emission fuel. And depending on the biofuel price, or a high EUA price, or a high conventional fuel price, it could be less expensive to blend with biofuels compared to buying credits. And not only does biofuel improve your EUA obligation, it also lowers your IMO's carbon intensity index, which is a measurement the IMO introduced in 2023. Of course, how can ACT help with securing biofuel volumes? We as ACT are a producer and supplier of physical biofuel. We are fully vertically integrated in the market, from sourcing our own feedstock to processing it to a viable biofuel, into blending it ourselves and physically supplying it into your vessels. All our drop-in biofuels are ICC certified and made from a waste or residue. Therefore, it can achieve significant carbon reduction, up to more than 90% of carbon reduction well to wake, so on the whole emissions chain of the fuel. Because we are in control of the whole supply chain, we can guarantee long-term deliveries of the same quality and quantity of biofuels, which is important for ship owners, as the quality and quantity, of course, is a significant part of their operations. Also, because we blend ourselves, we can blend specified to a ship owner's need, from a 10% blend up to 100% blend, with VLSFO, ULSFO, HSFO, or even DMA. Currently, we are active in the ARA region, but we are setting up and developing the Med, and of course also Singapore, as we are seeing demand rise there. What to look out for as a ship owner is the availability of biofuels, as sustainable biofuels are made from different types of feedstock that are quite finite. It's not like conventional fuels that are pumped out of the ground with millions of barrels a day. A sustainable biofuel is a finite source. And Europe will also introduce the Renewable Energy Directive 3, which will increase the obligation to blend biofuels into road transport and into aviation. And with the new measurements, for example, the EU ETS, the IMO's carbon intensity index, and in 2025, when FuelEU Maritime will be introduced, the interest for biofuels are increasing in the maritime sector, especially then in 2025, when it will become mandatory for marine fuels to lower their GHG intensity, and that can be done with biofuels. So that's why I think it's already important to start securing volumes this year for your fleet. thanks already for your questions. One of the questions we received was, will methane and NOx be charged using the same allowances as carbon dioxide? These other GHG gases will be converted to the carbon equivalent. So that means, if I'm not mistaken, methane will be, the amount of methane you emit will be multiplied with
the factor, which is 24.
Yeah.
So 1 ton of methane exposed would be 24 tons of carbon emitted. That is obviously dependent on, you know, the kind of emission, but there's always a factor. And the way that the EU ETS actually works is that all emissions are actually calculated as CO2 equivalents, right? So 1 ton of CO2 emitted is equivalent to 1 ton of CO2, of course, but 1 ton of methane emitted would be 24 tons of CO2. So that's how it translates. And yes, it's the same certificate. It's 1 EUA for 1 ton of carbon equivalent emissions. I hope to have answered this. If not, please obviously feel free to send us an email, schedule a quick phone call in order to discuss it further. Another question that we had pop up, and that's quite interesting, is there a year-on-year decrease in the cap for shipping sector? And the answer to this is yes, and it is the same decrease that is applied to the whole block, right? So the way that the EU ETS works in the first slide on the basics, it's visible, is that there's an overall emissions limit for all emissions that are captured in the EU ETS for all of the EU countries. And that cap decreases year by year by year. So therefore also the 2.2 or 2.4, or if we have our heightened ambitions for the emission reduction in 2030 come true and translated and transposed into the actual directive, then yes, that will be 3.2% per year. Another question is, oh yeah, that's also, I can take that. It's, what is the reason you would want to have a perfect average procurement price for EUAs, for the carbon emissions? And the reason for that is that it's easy to price for your customers, for the increase of the charters, the increase in costs of the charters, the increase in costs of the freights. And if you are a ship owner actually dealing with EUA procurement, then it is easy to add that on the fuel costs, for example, because you could simply go and say, for the year 2024, I will charge you on top of the usual costs, I will charge you the average of the emission prices. And the average is usually measured with the closing prices of every day, and then just build the arithmetic average of that over the year. With the procurement through the EEX primary auctions, you might be able to beat that average. Obviously, historic prices are no determinant for future developments, but in the year 2022, I was roughly 1% lower. So it is an ease of contractual structures, and it gives you a slight price advantage in case of going through the EEX primary auctions.
Thank you, Derek. We also received a question regarding what's the rationale behind the 50% of emissions for the inter-European voyages. The reason is that, will there not be carbon leakage? So the European Union did research on this, and as the cost of making a port call close to Europe before going to Europe to decrease your obligation would not be sensible. So no, they do not see a carbon leakage from using non-EU ports before going to an EU port in the near vicinity. But the European Union is looking into including 100% of these inter-European voyages in 2027.
How did you document the custody setup to be fully segregated from ACT, even though the main account is in your name? That is a good question, and it has to do with the setup of the Dutch MiFID II obligations. So for any financially regulated trader in the Netherlands, it is necessary to have a so-called custody foundation accounts for the safekeeping of client assets and values. So this main account that you mentioned in the question is actually held by the ACT Custody Foundation, which is a separate company. The setup between the ACT Custody Foundation and ACT Financial Solutions is in principle that the payments can only structure through the custody foundation to the exchanges, to the end clients, and to the ACT Financial Solutions. So it can only be released to you, to the exchanges, or to us, which means that we cannot make these payments for anything else. It will never be used as, it will never hit our working capital. It will never be in our prop book. It will always be in the separated bankruptcy separated entity, which is the ACT Custody Foundation BV.
We also received a question regarding the 150 million EUAs that will need to be bought for shipping. This is not the cap that is set. This is the actual emissions obligation that ship owners will need to procure. So they will need to buy this amount from the existing pool of EU allowances. And that pool of the EU ETS is decreasing, as Fabio mentioned. But it is not, the 150 million allowances is not the cap set for shipping.
Would biomethane, grid injected, be accepted as blending product for bio-LNG supply for shippers? In general, yes, but it does depend on how the transport works towards the ship use. It is most likely not enough to simply use biomethane certificates themselves. It actually needs to be transported directly into the tank.
How long is it credited?
Ah, yeah. Okay. So what's the validity of a credit of an EUA allowance? The validity is unlimited. So there has been a clause added in the regulation that any credit valid now shall be valid in future compliance periods. The slight complexity of this issue is that the current compliance period ends in 2030, and then somewhere in 2028 we expect the new legislation for the next compliance period, which will run from 2031 to 2040. This will then once again include a clause that any credit that was valid in the current compliance period is also valid in the next compliance period. So this is covered. The EU actually made a quite dramatic blunder when moving from compliance period 1 to compliance period 2. They lacked this little clause. So all of a sudden, all credits became worthless, and the price for this credit tumbled to 0, and then the price for the next credit went back up again. And that will never ever happen again. So the credits will be valid until the EU ETS actually ends.
Yes, so we also get a question for vessels not making port calls to the European Union will be excluded from the EU ETS. As they do not make any port calls here, they will not have an obligation to report to the EU MRV, and therefore will not have an obligation to procure these EUAs.
Oh, and another important one here. Could you please reconfirm who is responsible for the process of reporting emissions, buying EUAs, and the other implications thereof? Apparently there has been a bug during that part of the webinar. I hope it was only on this user's end, but in case it wasn't, let me reiterate that again. Actually, could we maybe go back to the slide? because if there was a bug, like this is quite an important part of it. The regulation, the directive says that the obligation to surrender the EUAs on the 30th of April is with the DOC company.
The one who reports the MRV to MRV.
Exactly, the one who actually measures and reports the emissions to the authorities. This is complicated because their fleets are varying every year. And the person responsible for buying the EUAs is, according to the BIMCO clauses that we have discovered, the person who is paying for the fuel, or the company who is paying for the fuel, right? So the ship operator, right, or the charterer, the person using the ship is usually also paying for the fuel. And then they would deliver for every month of usage, for example, the allowances to the ship owners, who are the most exposed to the penalties, actually. And then the owners would, just before end of April, have to give those EUAs to the DOC company, who then needs to actually surrender it to the authorities. So this whole complexity, once again, is the point where I offered to use our custody accounts, where we could hold EUAs in a fully separated entity in your name, right? So that they're safeguarded by a legal setup of our custody accounts and custody foundation. Not only can you use spot EUAs, right? So available EUAs, but you could also hold claims in that custody account. So we could open a derivatives account, for example, within that custody foundation. So that's the way that you can actually use and start buying EUAs according to your forward chartering obligations and potentially fuel buying obligations.
We also received another question regarding your EUA obligations on voyages. So let's say, for example, you go from Asia to the United States. On that segment, you will have to pay 0 EUAs. You have no obligation. But if you then go from USA to, let's say, Rotterdam or another port in Europe, then on those emissions, you would need to pay 50%, or 50% of those emissions, you need to pay your allowances. But in the first year, it will be 40% of those 50% emissions that you will need to account for.
Another good one. If the market is based on supply and demand, how can we ever expect rates to go down? And this is, as I mentioned, the small specialty of the EU ETS market. It is based on regulation, and it is enforced that the cap will go down. So unless we see a large amount of companies drop out of the market, there is absolutely no way why emission allowances should be ever as cheap again as they were in the past. So the trend that you're seeing in the price development is a trend that is expected to hold up. Therefore, and that's why I keep insisting on it, that this is actually an opportunity to be able to deal with it on a faster and more efficient way, is that the way to procure is to start early and to be in the market now while you're already pricing your further charters, like your further obligations in the maritime industry. You should already hedge your EUA exposures. Otherwise, you will be running into those higher prices. Whereas if you deal with it now in an efficient way, it might actually give you a competitive advantage down the road.
To the last slide. I'm gonna round it up. It's 11 o'clock. I think we can therefore conclude the webinar. Thank you so much for your attention and also for your questions. We will be more than happy to send you our presentation. Here we also have our contact information. If you have any more questions regarding biofuels or EU ETS, we're more than happy to get into a more personal level to find solutions specified to your company needs. Because as you all know, each company is different and each require a different attention.
Absolutely. So also from my end, thanks again. And if we missed a question, we will try and answer it via email or get back to you in touch directly. And otherwise, just reach out to us anytime.
Have a nice day, guys.
Have a good day.
Thank
Ciao.
you.